We do ask that as you're listening to the introductory comments of my colleagues, of Dr. Crisher, Dr. Shively, Dr. Kim, you'd begin to go ahead and start submitting questions, and we'll queue those up and get to as many of them as possible. But before we get to those, I've asked each of the participants this evening to make a few introductory remarks, sort of frame the discussion from their disciplinary perspectives. Our order will be first Dr. Shively, then Dr. Kim, and then sort of batting cleanup will be Dr. Kreischer. So, Dr. Shively, you're up.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ramsey. Now, Dr. Ramsey did ask me to keep things short, all of us to keep things short at the beginning. In 2020, I published a book on Trump's foreign policy, and I'm trying to finish one on Biden's foreign policy right now. So I felt like that was pretty close to a human rights violation to ask an academic to do that. But I'll see what I can do, and we'll fill in the gaps later with your questions. I thought it might be helpful. There's a lot of directions we can go here, but I thought it might be helpful to frame what's happening in the campaigns on foreign policy partly as the meeting of two broad approaches to the U.S. role in the world. One is the kind of internationalism or American internationalism that the U.S. has been engaged in since World War II or after World War II. There's been a lot of variations in that, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment over time, but it's been fairly stable, I would argue, versus a more nationalist approach, which we've seen variations before, but I think Trump's approach in particular would represent a pretty big break, if he was able to fully implement it. So those are the broad stakes. I'll talk about that briefly, and then maybe mention on each, we'll say Biden-Harris, since Harris has not really conducted foreign policy on her own yet, where they stand on some specific issues. Now, by internationalism, what I mean is the broad post-war order with U.S. military dominance. This was locked in, of course, at the beginning of the Cold War. Americans began to invest heavily in that sort of approach to the world. But it also involves a heavy emphasis on international trade, free and open commerce, building alliance networks, committing to alliance networks, kind of active engagement in the world to try to tip things in the U.S. favor. This continues after the end of the Cold War, of course, which makes me suspect that it is kind of baked in at this point to American political culture and investments. There's a lot of rhetoric about supporting democracy, a lot of emphasis on what they will often call the rules-based international order, right? And we can talk about what that means. One way to summarize this is what Secretary of State Blinken said a couple of years ago. He said, the world does not organize itself, to start a speech. And what he meant was the United States is at the top of this global order, and it has a responsibility to be actively engaged. Trump, by contrast, represents a pretty big break with that mentality. There are a lot of reasons for why we might be at that place, but in brief, it's the America First idea, right? And now that versions of that trace back into we'll say the 20s and the 30s. We can talk about what that means. Trump may have not been thinking in those terms, but that's sort of where he landed because there is an existing tradition in American politics. So this on trade and security, it's more focused on who is valuable to us and who isn't, rather than who's our friends and allies. Avoiding fixed commitments. It's more reactive and skeptical to U.S. involvement in the world. So if there's an issue, you go deal with it, but you don't necessarily make big long-term commitments. Not much talk about democracy, but rather national rights and sovereignty as a priority, and an emphasis on U.S. national culture, and an increased concern about immigration, right? So those are all elements of nationalism, and you can see how that links kind of domestic priorities with a view of the U.S. role in the world. Trump summarized this, I think, pretty well in 2017 in a speech to the UN, where he said he wanted a great reawakening of nations, and he talked about a focus on sovereignty. So the idea here is we all exist together side by side, but we're also sort of doing our own thing. We'll move back and forth between partners and allies as needed. And he was even willing to challenge like the Canadians and the Europeans on longstanding trade alliances. So those are the two broad visions that I think are represented in these campaigns. Trump would probably have a harder time bringing about dramatic change simply because of the long-standing existing investments in the internationalist view. But it's a real debate that Americans are having, and I don't see the debate itself going away anytime soon. So I'm about out of time. We can talk about specific issues as they relate to those as we open the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Shively. Dr. Kim, if you want to step up next.
Yeah, I agree a lot with Dr. Shively. Uh, so in the presidential debate, issues like about Asia, like U.S.-China relations, was barely mentioned. But we can still look at the track records of Trump and Harris to have some idea about what their foreign policy is going to look like. But I will focus more on the perspectives of Asia and China, which I'm more familiar with. So based on Trump's American first approach, so U.S. interests, as Dr. Shively said, are much more narrowly defined. So he said, I'm the president of the United States. I'm not the president of the globe. So U.S. Has long been taken advantage of by the allies, according to his view. So Trump, I think, has a transactional outlook about foreign relations. So countries must pay for access to U.S. markets and U.S. security. Because of that, he also emphasizes measurable and quantifiable aspects of foreign relations, like trade deficits, military spending, to demonstrate his effectiveness. In terms of style, I think Trump prefers leader-to-leader bargain over working through international institutions, kind of perceiving himself as a great deal maker on behalf of American people. So in terms of trade, Trump promised to increase tariffs on China even further to as much as 60%. So if Trump was elected for a second term, he's likely to prioritize economic and trade issues in terms of how to deal with China. And some Asian allies felt concerned he might be willing to compromise some of the strategic interests of allies to have concession from countries like China, Russia, and North Korea. Under Biden administration, Biden-Harris consider U.S. global leadership as a key to American power. So they are more willing to work through established institutions and consider allies as source of strength rather than burdens. In terms of trade, I think there is a bipartisan consensus on limiting foreign access to U.S. markets in terms of tariffs and subsidies. But if Harris is elected, the protectionist policy is more likely to be targeted and more selective compared to Trump's. The last point I want to make, so historically, there has been a relatively high level of continuity in terms of U.S. foreign policy. So whoever will be elected as president, the U.S. security commitment to the region of Asia is unlikely to change. Also, in terms of free trade, U.S. Is likely to continue to feel reluctant to participate in free trade. For example, a free trade agreement, Trans-Pacific Partnership. U.S. is not a member of that, but UK is a member of that. This is likely to continue. So in the case, if the China's economy continues to decline, it is possible China might take riskier behaviors, which might harm the regional stability.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Before you start, Dr. Crisher, I'd like to go ahead and remind those just joining the meeting that while we're giving these introductory remarks, if you have some burning questions you'd like the panelists to discuss, go ahead and use the Q&A app at the bottom of the screen to post your questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. All right, Dr. Crisher, you're up.
Thank you. So I'm going to focus my comments around the idea of sort of asking the question, does foreign policy even have much of an influence on presidential elections? The conventional wisdom is no, they don't. James Carville, Clinton's political strategist in the early 90s, sort of very famously said, it's the economy, stupid. By and large, voters care about economic issues and other domestic policies. Now, while that may be the conventional wisdom, the reality is that at least indirectly, foreign policy has always had an influence on US elections. And I think with 2024, it might serve as a potential outlier in how foreign policy could be actually have a much more direct influence on the election. The models at this point are pointing to a really close election. When we have really close elections, things that happen out at the margins have the ability to have a large impact. And foreign policy playing at the margins could potentially have an impact on the upcoming election. And there's three areas in particular I think we could sort of look at to sort of see what the potential influence of foreign policy could be in this election. I'll sort of go over them relatively quickly. The first is a sort of more traditional way foreign policy does play a role in elections, and that is the candidates want to appear tough because Americans want a tough president that can navigate the international arena, be tough against rivals, sort of make America look good on the international stage. So here, when we think of Harris, right, she's doubly disadvantaged. She's a Democrat. Democrats are traditionally painted as being weak in terms of foreign policy, and she's also a woman. And women are sort of seen as inherently weak when it comes to politics and international relations. Hillary Clinton faced similar issues in 2016. And so when we watch Harris giving interviews and when she does talk about foreign policy, she has a tendency to get into some details of foreign policy, but by and large, she has a tendency to sort of pull it back to, and I'm doing these policies because I'm going to be tough on China, or I'm going to be tough on Russia, or I'm going to be tough on countries like Iran. Now, Trump, on the other hand, right, his whole persona is kind of built around being tough. He takes great pride in that idea. In much like Harris, when Trump does address foreign policy issues, there's really little to no details about how he will accomplish something. It's more about, I'm going to be tough, and because of my toughness, I will get results. And by and large, this is not new. The presidents have used this sort of, or candidates have used this line of attack throughout history. Eisenhower used it against Truman during the Korean War. Nixon used it against Humphreys during the Vietnam War. Reagan used it against Carter as well. So the sort of "I'm tough, my opponent is not" is fairly new. It's not new. It's fairly traditional in U.S. politics. A second area where foreign policy can matter, so touches on some of the comments Dr. Kim made, is tariffs. Decisions about tariffs absolutely fall under foreign policy. And as Dr. Kim was saying, right, we have somewhat similar policies here between the two candidates, but also notable differences. And Trump has stated his intention of imposing double-digit tariffs on all U.S. imports. Right? Tariffs are necessary to fight back against an unfair trade system, and it's necessary to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. It's possible this is simply bluster, right? This is a way of appearing tough and sort of showing that, hey, he's actually going to be fighting for American workers. But economists are very worried. They're worried about the consequences, what it may have as an impact on the U.S. economy and the impact on consumer prices, which undoubtedly will go up. Harris is going to be a little less extreme in terms of tariffs, but she's also fairly pro-tariff as well. She won't be as broad as Trump, but she's going to continue on the tariffs of Biden, who continued some of Trump's tariffs from his first administration. But I think, as Dr. Kim said, she will be a little bit more targeted, going against rival states such as China. So Harris has this interesting balancing act where she has to both talk about the dangers of Trump's tariffs while at the same time saying, well, but the tariffs I'm going to use are okay, and sort of help her seem like she's tough as well. And what's interesting is free trade generally still pulls pretty well in the U.S. And so in that sense, we have two candidates, by and large, going against public opinion. And perhaps when we look at sort of so-called undecided voters, this might be a pocketbook issue that could appeal to them and potentially could sway some voters one way or the other. Lastly, a foreign policy issue that may directly speak to voters, and that's the conflict between Israel and Hamas. And simply put, Harris is in a no-win situation here. This is very tough for her politically. Elements of her base want a more strong stance against Israeli actions. If she does that, she might pull in some of those elements of her base, but at the same time lose pro-Israeli elements of her base and perhaps moderate voters as well. But if she's not forceful enough for those pro-Palestinian base, those voters might stay home or vote for a third-party candidate. Now, this issue, I don't think nationally will necessarily be a big deal, but for states like Michigan, right, this could be a big deal with their large population of Arab voters being a swing state. So even losing a single swing state could be the difference between winning and losing the election. That being said, pro-Palestinian groups in Michigan have started to put out statements saying, we're not going to endorse Harris, but asking members there's less concern about this issue overall. And this issue is not problematic for Trump whatsoever. He's not worried about alienating pro-Palestinian voters. He's pretty clear. If he wins, he wants Israel to finish the conflict quickly and essentially through any means necessary. So while elections, yes, are traditionally about the economy, a close election allows other issues to influence the margins. Foreign policy is one of those issues that can influence the margins. And it could be enough to get Trump back in office or for Harris to finally break the gender glass ceiling.
All right. Thank you all for keeping those introductory comments brief. We have our first question from the audience. And I'm going to ask it the way it's written and leave you to hear in the question what you would like to hear. We'll give Dr. Crisher the first chance to respond, but then if either Kim or Shively would also like to. Which party do you suppose tends to have policies that benefit foreign nations?
It depends. I think both parties do things that will benefit foreign nations. I don't think it's, the Republicans tend to not help foreign nations and Democrats do tend to help foreign nations. You might get different sort of states in general, right? So Democrats may be, more willing to help traditional allies, but also maybe helping sort of lesser developed countries, depending upon, sort of their economic leanings. Whereas Republicans are, they're going to help traditional allies as well. But then they also might help states that we might not consider a great actor, but they help in some sort of larger strategic purpose, right? So you think under Bush Jr. in the war on terror, right? The U.S. helping countries like Pakistan, which was not necessarily a good actor, but they were very important in the war on terror, or even initially the U.S. Sort of helping out China. So Bush Jr. sort of fostering a more cooperative relationship with China sort of early on in that war on terror as well. So I don't think it's one or the other. One party benefits one, countries and the other one does not. They both do, but maybe they have sort of different approaches how they go about helping other countries.
Thank you, Dr. Crisher. Dr. Kim, Dr. Shively, would either of you like to chime in on that question?
Yeah, I will just add a couple points. I agree with that overall assessment. One way to think about this is your overall, as I started out with, your overall framework for the world. And if you think about you're a leading state like the US and you're trying to pitch what you're trying to do in the world, you want to make it beneficial to those people you're trying to work with. So the way U.S. foreign policy is usually pitched to partners and allies is this helps you too. So even in a nationalist framework, Trump was always trying to say, well, look, we can do business with you that's good for you, it's good for me. And if we want to buy your goods, or we'll turn a blind eye to X if you help us with Y. So that is pretty standard behavior. Now but that's a different way to think about helping, right? It's framed as sort of practical and mutually reinforcing, whereas under the internationalist framework, your approach is more trying to elevate all boats, right? Cause all boats to rise together. So we focus on free trade. We might send aid and humanitarian support to certain areas under the theory that that helps them, but it also sort of like dealing with poverty in your community or something like that. It generally creates more stability in the world. It generally creates more wealth, and that redounds to the U.S. benefit. So basically, what's happening is U.S. foreign policy is based around U.S. national interests, and the way we frame and understand those interests is how that gets enacted and how it gets, how we talk about it, rather than who gets helped or not. It's usually more like, what are our interests and how do we get to those?
I have a rather lengthy question. I'm going to try to reduce it down to what I think is its essential. It involves, the thinking that maybe as nations industrialize, or as their economy develops, they might go through certain stages. And the observation is that it looks like China is sort of skipping the stage of industrial development where they would have gasoline-powered vehicles and move straight into having an economy that produces and relies on electric vehicles. And so then the question to the panel, and I guess Dr. Kim, will start with you on this one, but then throw it to the others as well. How does that impact China's relations with the U.S. if they go all in on producing electric vehicles? Does that have an impact on how we relate to China? How China relates to our allies? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In the past several decades, since the 1980s, Chinese economic reform, China's economic growth has largely relied on several different factors. First is export-oriented low-cost manufacturing, which has been critical to China's development, as well as government spending is another major driver of Chinese GDP. Also, the infrastructure projects, real estate developments. All these are important drivers of China's GDP. But as the Chinese economy develops, China moves from a low-income country to a middle-income country. So we have this concept referred to as a middle-income trap. Basically, a lot of countries like Taiwan and South Korea, maybe in the future also just China, when they become a middle-income country, they kind of become trapped at this status. It's very hard for them to move from the middle-income country to a high-income country because they have depended on low-cost, low labor cost manufacturing, export-oriented economic development. So what China is trying to do, for example, China had this plan called Made in China 2025. Basically, China wanted to upgrade its entire manufacturing chain, and automobile is just one of those sectors. There's also other industries that is important to China, like semiconductor, like AI. All these are important if China wants to move from a middle-income country to a high-income country. So I think it's a logical step for China to focus and invest in electric vehicles or even other renewable energy vehicles. And China, yes, there is a lot of government subsidies in terms of that, also favorable local policies to encourage people to purchase more electric vehicles. Because China economy developed based on manufacturing, so some of the technologies like battery manufacturing has already been relatively mature, so they can basically utilize these technologies and apply it to vehicle manufacturing. Well, the U.S. response is that it has trying to restricting China's development, China's export of electric vehicles because labor is still much cheaper in China compared to the US. So it's gonna affect the US market. So that's the US, what the US is trying to do, trying to protect the US market and to restrict export of electric vehicles from China.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Dr. Shively, Dr. Kreischer, you want to put in a word on that question?
I have a little extension here because I've been talking with my a graduate class about technology and national security. And so one way to extend that question is to ask how is the US or how are these respective candidates going to respond to, or and this specifically China, innovating or maybe trying to leapfrog the US on some of these technologies. One answer, as we've already pointed to, is that the tariffs that we've been talking about that a Harris administration would likely continue from the Biden administration are specifically targeted at trying to keep China from acquiring things like certain types of microchips to further develop their AI and that type of thing. So what we're likely to see is basically the U.S. getting a lot more aggressive or continuing to push on trying to slow down, we'll say, Chinese innovation. They've shifted from everyone benefits from trade to a little more zero sum in their view on trade. Another way to frame that, I think, from the Biden administration in the last few years was this idea of the foreign policy for the middle class, where what they wanted to do was say we're going to build up U.S. manufacturing and infrastructure and try to reduce reliance on particularly supply chains coming out of China. So I think one way to look at that question is how do U.S. policymakers understand themselves competing with China? And it seems like their frame of reference have shifted from let's just be open and expand, and they'll come along, and versus they're a competitor, and we need to try to keep them down, and at the same time build up our own economic base.
Dr. Shively, don't mute too quickly. The next one's right up your alley. Maybe trace out any differences you see between what the foreign policy of Biden has been and maybe any kind of strategic vision that he would have for how the world works and what America's place in the world would be. And have you read any tea leaves or seen any signs of what a Harris administration would look like, how it might differ from Biden's understanding of America's place in the world?
Yeah, so starting at the second point a little bit, Harris has been pretty cagey, I think partly because as vice president, she really doesn't and can't really speak out and undermine the president with her own direct views. So she's like said, oh, I agree with Biden on everything, but I definitely won't be Biden either, right? So she's in this kind of bind on foreign policy. But I think she will probably carry forward a lot of what Biden has done because she didn't have a lot of foreign policy background coming in, and she seems to have spent a lot of time as vice president studying up, we'll say, and experiencing foreign policy under Biden. So it seems likely that she would continue his framework. So the thing to understand about Biden is that he is a Cold Warrior, right? He came into the Senate in the 70s. His formative experience is the Cold War. And if you look back at his rhetoric over his entire career, it's emphasizing democracy, competing with, autocracies. He's just got a whole series of stock like concepts, the way he understands the world. So that's pretty firmly falls into that liberal internationalist view, but it's one that was more amenable because he was also a union guy, as he says, more amenable to tariffs and a slightly more nationalist approach or nationalist interpretation of that internationalism. So the other thing to keep in mind with Biden that I don't think would transfer over to Harris, however, is that his whole view of foreign policy is that it's about people, right? It's about talking to people. He kind of ridicules foreign policy experts for talking about systems and impersonal structures and says it's just you got to talk to somebody, you got to make a deal. I grew up in the Senate, and that's the framework I apply to diplomacy. I don't think that would transfer to Harris because that's just not her experience. So that's the variable I don't know. How would she take forward this kind of nationalist frame of internationalism, if that even makes sense together, but make it her own. And so one thing to look for is who would she appoint into key positions, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, that type of thing.
Yeah, if I could ask the follow-up there. I mean, do we know who she associates with, who she reads, who she would be likely to be her close inner circle of advisors on foreign policy? Would she pick somebody outside of the mainstream, or pick like a normal, experienced Democratic operative for these sorts of things?
Yeah, she would mostly rely on the insiders. We do have some insight because as vice president, she's appointed a couple of advisors who are one, I've been following this scholar's work. I'm drawing a blank on her name at the moment, but she's been making the case for restraint in U.S. foreign policy, or a kind of version of restraint where the U.S. remains in a leadership position, but maybe pulls back on big military investments and commitments around the world, is a lot more careful about overdoing it on international military commitments in particular. So I think so. We do see a little bit of insight. That's not really an out of the mainstream type of person. It's more of an update on some of the older folks that Biden would have brought in, right? So they're the younger generation version of the older advisors that Biden has. These are the people who grew up around the Iraq War, the response to 9/11, and that type of thing. And their view is the U.S. overreached over the last generation. They want to somehow reel that in a little bit. Whereas the Biden people, their frame of reference is the Cold War. So they're more comfortable with a more ponderous U.S. role in the world. So that might be one way to think about a difference between the two.
I'll throw this out to the three of you. A question about balancing concern with international affairs, with our relations with other nations. We spend money, right, on our relations with them. How do we balance a concern with keeping conditions abroad stable, peaceful, orderly, and spending domestically? And so, if voters begin to feel, you've heard that there are politicians who make arguments that we're spending too much on our foreign agreements and not enough on Americans, right? And so that seems to be a part of Mr. Trump's appeals, is to say we've negotiated bad deals, we're spending too much, people need to pay their fair share, and we need to start rebuilding internally. So what do you think about how to well, how have we calibrated foreign spending with domestic spending, and do you see that maybe that what we've been doing over the last generation is in the process of changing, or are we more likely to stay the course?
I think by and large, I don't think you're going to see spending change too drastically. I think probably under Trump, you might see a little bit less spending, but again, it's as Dr. Shively is saying, it's going to be driven by national interest. So you're still going to see money sent abroad in the interest of national interest. And I think really when we see some of these critiques on sort of U.S. spending in the foreign arena, it's by and large going after like the aid packages to Ukraine, and aid packages to Israel and things of that nature, right? Sort of, we gave Ukraine $30 billion. We could have used that money to help rebuild after these last couple of hurricanes, and I think part of the issue is sort of the fundamental misunderstanding of what that money is doing and where that money is going. With those sort of aid packages to, like Ukraine and things like that, right? People have this image of, Joe Biden as handing Zelensky a check, sort of big check in front of the cameras and things like that, where that's not the case. That money is by and large going to U.S. war industry manufacturing and being used to produce more weapons that are refilling U.S. stockpiles, and we're sort of shoving the old stuff to Ukraine. So in that sense, right, we don't frame it that way for some reason, right? That these aid packages are actually incredibly beneficial for U.S. manufacturing, and it in many ways has helped sort of reinvigorate U.S. manufacturing, at least from the sort of war-making capacity. But I think one of the elements that Trump had correct in his first term and was, allies not necessarily paying their fair share, the U.S. sort of unduly taking on most of the spending burden. But we've also seen that change under Biden. The NATO allies are now spending more. They're hitting the 2% benchmark, and that complaint is not new. Presidents for a long time have complained about NATO allies not doing their fair share. So I think there's probably a little bit to it, but I also think the U.S. could do a much better job of selling the American public of this is what we're getting out of this. This is the influence we're getting. This is, it reaps sort of benefits down the road, maybe in ways we don't sort of appreciate. So I think we could do a much better job of explaining what's going on and how that does benefit us. So it makes a lot of sense to ask these questions about that. So, but I wouldn't necessarily imagine some of that spending to go away. It will just sort of find a different way to exit the country.
We're starting to get a number of questions. So, if we maybe forego the rest of you talking on that one to get to another one. This one's it's multi-pronged, and I'll let you choose which prong you want to answer if you want to answer all of them. But the general topic area is Afghanistan. We were there for a while. Did we achieve what we wanted to accomplish there? But especially, it involves the terms of our departure from Afghanistan. So the first prong, there was an agreement that Mr. Trump negotiated directly with the Taliban, maybe without consulting openly with the Afghan government. Is that uncommon that you would have a president, an American president, negotiating with a non-state actor without sort of also bringing in the sovereign, the national government that has a stake in the issue? But then also when Biden removed the American presence from Afghanistan, there were a lot of weapons left behind, American just stuff, right? We left an air base that we'd spent a lot of money on there. But maybe that led to sort of the black market in arms being resupplied, that then a lot of people who wanted to create mischief could go get the American war material and start selling it. So either of those questions that you'd like to talk about, I think there have been several questions in that ballpark.
Well, I have a few thoughts here. I actually wrote an article a little bit evaluating the Biden decision process for withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I suggest everyone look that up. But but to directly answer these, on the Trump negotiation, I mean, I think you're right. And this happened with Biden too. They did not consult really with the Afghans, and that's part of what destroyed, led to the total destruction of the Afghan government. Now, the Afghan government itself was pretty much in denial that any of this was going to happen, that the U.S. would really leave. Yeah, that's easy to overstate. I think both Biden and Trump administration people want to say, well, it was on them too. To some degree, that's accurate. But it's also the case that what both Biden and Trump wanted to do in their own ways was to just get out of there. I don't know if Trump would have we don't know if he would have really pulled the trigger ultimately. They did start that process, and once it was moving, there was an agreement with the Taliban that that the Biden administration could then point to and say, well, this is already exists, and so we're going to work within this framework to leave. There's a whole discussion about, the withdrawal itself that we can get into. I don't want to sidetrack too much from that. But jumping to the back end of the question, on the stuff left behind, I haven't, long story short, I'll just say, I've not seen any evidence that ultimately that made a big difference. The U.S. material, it's galling, right? Same thing happened in Vietnam. The U.S. left a bunch of materiel, but ultimately, the effect is pretty marginal, partly because they spike a lot of the stuff or they leave it unusable. And some of this U.S. good, as the Ukrainians are finding out, a lot of U.S. material, military goods are really complicated and they need a lot of maintenance, and they break down pretty fast without that. That's been that kind of created issues for the Iranians back in the 70s and 80s. But the real problem of a government collapsing and it spiraling into asymmetrical wars was when the Soviet Union collapsed. All of those goods really did flood onto the black market, and that far more than what happened in Afghanistan, did kind of lead to a lot of knock-on effects around the world in asymmetric conflicts. So that directly answers those two specific questions.
A quick sort of tag onto that, the sort of idea of negotiating around an actor that's directly involved. This is not new. Nixon and Kissinger directly negotiated with North Vietnam and really didn't let South Vietnam know what was going on. And this led to the sort of collapse of the initial deal they had after the Linebacker 1 air campaign, because Nixon and Kissinger had negotiated to allow North Vietnamese troops to remain in South Vietnam without telling the South Vietnamese government that they had made those conditions. So it's happened before where the state at hand is sort of left in the dark about what's going on. And I believe this happened to Czechoslovakia as well prior to World War II, with the negotiating the removal of the Sudetenland and giving that to Germany. I don't believe the Czech government was involved in that either. So there's history, there's precedent there for that sort of thing happening.
Looks like we've had some more questions about tariffs. It's just a term we hadn't used too much in American politics for a little while. And so you can see people are starting to think through. This seems to be one strain of their thinking. Are there, this business of reshoring American manufacturing critical industries, when you start looking at American foreign, what are the industries where we might not want to be reliant on others or on a free market, a global free market to supply us with things, but we would want to maybe through intentional economic policy ensure that there was a capacity here in the States to produce certain kinds of things. This wasn't in the question, but I've heard the argument that steel was important. We should have a capacity to continue to make steel here in the States and not just buy it on the open market. And maybe also antibiotics, right? Is some kinds of medication that are a part of how we do medicine here in the States. And if we're not making it ourselves and don't have the labs to produce it, that could be a vulnerability. But along those kinds of lines, what are your thoughts about critical manufacturing capacity?
All right. Well, I hate to keep jumping in first here, but we were talking about this in my grad course. I was writing about this recently in one of my chapters. Probably the most prominent topics, and when Biden came in, they did a whole series of like executive orders to review the U.S. industrial base for these types of things. So the software or the supply chain in general became an issue, right? After COVID, everybody recognized that was a concern. one phrase that emerged, I don't know how helpful it is, but was friendshoring. So rather than relying on possible adversaries, right, try to shift U.S. trade on those sensitive areas to Australia or to Europe or Latin America, right, Southeast Asia. So there are a lot of alternate places where you can get things that basically aren't China, right? That's their big concern, their big target. Microchips are the other like huge issue that everyone is obsessed with at the moment. The Inflation Reduction Act included a lot of aid to build factories, billions of dollars, right, to build factories in the U.S. and like Arizona for microchips. So there's a handful of those. Another one that I looked at was software that ends up in the U.S. government. They were really obsessed with that because when you have open source materials that people are using to create their software, someone anywhere along the line could be injecting some kind of malicious code. So that's a real problem, a giant headache that they're really obsessed with at the federal government level at the moment. Yes, to respond to your specific example, the Americans have not been very good at the steel they produce is good, but it's not cost effective. And so a lot of it is left, but it feels uncomfortable for it to just not be in the US at all, right? It is a kind of critical issue. So the most recent thing is Japan, a Japanese firm buying, Pennsylvania Steel or a steel company in Pennsylvania. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that the Americans are having a hard time making it effectively, cheaply, but it's hard without a lot of like aggressive government intervention. It's hard to keep those things here. So that's part of the balance. Americans want a free and open market. How much do you let the government or have the government intervene on some of these? So it's a little more targeted at immediate security threats, I would say, like the microchips and the software and that type of thing.
I think Dr. Shively hits the main point at the end, right? When we're thinking just overall economic efficiency of these industries, you look at socialist countries where you have industries that are almost solely dependent upon government subsidies to run. They're not good. They tend to produce bad things. It stifles innovation, right? It holds back growth, and particularly if you're going to have large industries that we, in theory, can't afford to fail, right? They don't have incentives to sort of make the next step in sort of industrial development. So, cost effective, it's not going to be very high, right? I don't know how much money and subsidies Intel has gotten over the last couple of years to sort of boost their chip manufacturing capabilities, and it just hasn't done anything, very little. And even some of the subsidies Trump pushed during his first administration to sort of kickstart manufacturing in places like Ohio and like that, either the factories never started or they quickly shut down because they just weren't viable without continued influxes of government money. So it's really tough. And I think what Dr. Shively was saying is right, shifting some of these production lines to sort of more friendly nations is probably the good compromise here. I think the idea that we're somehow going to make the US fully self-sufficient, go to sort of autarky or something like that, it can happen. We potentially have the capacity to make it happen, but government spending is going to go through the roof. And additionally, there's going to be knock-on effects where the products that these places are selling are not going to be as cheap as what you get on the open market. And so now it's just more expensive for other manufacturing processes even before it even gets to consumers. So it is a really tough topic. It sounds great that you're going to pull all of this stuff back within the U.S., but I think the economic reality is that it's unlikely to happen, and it's a political promise.
Yeah, just to add one thing there, that's why tariffs are so appealing because they slow down the flow of goods from somewhere else and make those things more expensive. And in theory, it then allows U.S. manufacturers to compete. But it's also, economists would say less efficient, and really you're just passing the cost on ultimately to consumers. So it's a stopgap solution.
All right, we got one. We'll direct this one to Dr. Kim to get him back in the conversation. It involves the relationship between maybe a crisis in confidence in American institutions and foreign competitors, strategic competitors. So, what use might, if they're not adversaries, maybe we can all be friends, right? But competitors, what use might be made of a lack of faith or a growing distrust of institutions by foreign powers?
Yeah, I think one of the strengths of the U.S. power is relies on its role in international institutions as well as allies. So Trump, by bypassing these institutions, will kind of undermine allies' confidence in terms of U.S. commitment to security, like a lot of Asian countries. They're concerned about if Mr. Trump was elected for a second term, the U.S. Might compromise some of the strategic interests for deal making with other countries like China and Russia. Uh, also another aspect of U.S. power is soft power, right? So how to become a superpower is not enough to have a strong economy and strong military. You also need some kind of soft power, a cultural hegemony as well. So values are definitely important to U.S. power, and like democratic value, human rights, all these are embedded in international institutions. And it's kind of important to preserve these institutions. And China tried to create its alternative institutions in Asia, like developmental banks, and its own Belt and Road Initiative to challenge the U.S.-led international institutions. But I think the U.S. Strength of U.S. power continue to rely on these institutions, which can be very important.
It's common when we discuss American elections to talk about an October surprise, a strategy of one campaign or another. Uh, and in any panel on foreign policy, we'd want to talk about current events. I browsed headlines and I noticed that just in the last 24 hours, American bombers struck some arms deep, I don't know the vocabulary, some storage facilities deep underground in Yemen that had been used to maybe nuisance oil and other material moving through the Gulf. And also related to the conflict in Israel, that the Hamas chief had been killed recently. Are we going to see maybe more October surprises in the foreign policy arena that could have an impact on the election? Do you think either of those are really going to move the needle one way or the other?
The first example, no. For the most part, what's happening with Yemen is more or less happening underneath the radar. I do think Israel could be the country to serve up the October surprise. Potentially, if you're Harris, you are praying very hard for de-escalation. You absolutely want de-escalation of the conflict. That's in her interest. And I think you can make the argument, particularly for Netanyahu, that's not in his interest. And so we're still waiting for the Israeli retaliation against Iranian missile strikes. And, at least initially, it seems like Biden has gotten word from Netanyahu that they will indeed avoid going after nuclear sites and things like that, and just focus more on sort of conventional military targets. But what we've seen here in the last couple months is Netanyahu is going to do what he wants, regardless of how Biden feels. So it's entirely possible that we see some sort of escalation, either deeper escalation with Lebanon or deeper escalation with Iran, that puts Biden in a bind and will have sort of knock-on effects to the Harris campaign. So I guess in terms of foreign policy, that's where I would look for a potential surprise. Not that it's going to happen, but that what I would say, that's where the potential lies.
Yeah, that's the primary space I would look for also. Secondary might be something in Ukraine, something dramatic, particularly if the Ukrainian front starts collapsing somewhere. Somewhat ironically, that would look bad for Biden-Harris, even though Biden has pushed a bunch of support there because like the thing you supported is falling apart, right? Rather, he would read it as, well, we need more support, right? So vote for us. But I think the public would read it as, you're failing. We need something different, right? Another possibility might be something in Latin America where there's a lot of refugees suddenly flowing toward the U.S. That seems less likely, but that's the sort of thing that would actually get on the radar in domestic U.S. media.
We have a question about the BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and what growth there and development there might mean for our relationship, America's relationship with what the question asker calls the global South. So, uh, you know, I'll just leave it at that. That's the way the question was asked.
I'm going to jump on this, much like Dr. Shively. I've been talking about some of the stuff in my grad seminar, and last night we were actually talking about this sort of question. In part, I think a focus on the acronym BRICS really should go away. It should just be a focus on India and China. Brazil is not doing well these days. Russia is not doing well these days. South Africa has sort of very limited impacts. But India, China, these are major economic actors, and these are folks that are creating sort of a balance to sort of the long-standing American domination of global economics, along with the EU. So in one sense, yeah, it is a threat because they want to challenge U.S. control. I think we've seen a casualty, and I think that is the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is, by and large, mostly defunct at this point in time. We don't hear about it very much. The economic system relies on regional trade agreements now, not much in terms of the WTO. And a lot of the downfall of the WTO was caused by the rise of India and China, where they wanted to renegotiate terms within the WTO that they never could sort of agree on, and that sort of last round of negotiations never sort of completed. So it will change U.S. relations, European relations with the South, because now you don't have the same ability to sort of bully these countries with your economic might because they have economic might of their own. And we've seen India in particular sort of very effectively use this sort of economic might to find the ability to not to offend the US or necessarily offend the Russia in sort of these sort of global sort of power struggles we're seeing here as well. So I don't know if threat is the right word, but certainly challenging American control of the global economic market, but get rid of the B, the R, and the S. We'll stick with the ick. It's not as catchy though.
I had actually a question on that for Dr. Kim. Because you mentioned China trying to build like alternative structures and frameworks in its region, right? Well, that's kind of the first stepping stone is to try to build some kind of alternative frameworks in their region and some global frameworks. So can you tell us a little bit, or do you know, are there some specific like competitors basically to these economic institutions that the US has led for a long time?
Yeah, after the economic reform in China in the 1980s, China really wanted to be part of the global market and also with the US support after the 1990s. So the assumption of the US at the time was that to incorporate China into the global economy, so when China became more economically developed, it will become more politically open as well. But obviously that assumption didn't work. And also, increasingly, China feels that despite the reality that China has becoming economically and militarily more powerful, but its interest is not reflected or recognized in international institutions led by the United States. So yeah, China, because of that, China wanted to build its own alternative institutions like development banks. BRICS is one of that. Also, Belt and Road. Basically, BRICS and Belt and Road both focus on infrastructure projects. But about the future of the BRICS, I'm not really sure about that. I think I agree with Dr. Crisher. It's a very diverse and broad alliance, mainly concerned with economic issues. Yeah. But China definitely want to be more assertive in terms of protecting its economic interests as well as strategic interests globally and with its own institutions as alternatives.
All right, we've had a few more. People are still asking trade-related, tariff-related questions. So, an extreme example, supposing a policy of trying to return American manufacturing capacity to about 75% of what it was at the time of World War II. Just sort of spin out that line of thinking. What would some of the unanticipated consequences of that kind of industrial policy be?
I guess okay, we return to 75% manufacturing, right? Let's go with the hypothetical. Where in the world are you going to get the workers from? I mean, that is my initial question. Where in the world are we going to get workers for that sort of manufacturing expansion? When the reality is we don't have enough workers for our jobs right now. Multiple times the last couple of years, we've run into issues where we've had more jobs available than workers available. And quite frankly, that ain't a good thing. People tend to celebrate that as sort of a sign of a great economy, but that's not the case, right? That's a sign that you're sort of reaching real limitations. So if we were able to sort of rebuild manufacturing, I can suggest where we get workers from, but that is going to push back against policies of parties where we're going to have to start importing workers, and that is also politically very unpopular. So sort of not even thinking sort of outside of other economic implications, my sort of initial thought would be who in the world is going to work at all of these new factories?
We had not a related question, another question about manufacturing capacity. This one tying the idea of U.S. aid to foreign countries to the phenomena of China offshoring some of its manufacturing capacity, especially in the continent of Africa. Is there a sense in which American foreign aid sort of draws China into an arms race for development of manufacturing capacity in other parts of the world? Like they feel the need to grow manufacturing relationships outside of China because America is making these contributions.
I've never heard that that's the case. It's plausible, right? I've never heard that that was what was happening. In the case of Africa is instructive because the Chinese, and maybe Dr. Kim knows more about this than me, but my read is that they look at Africa as a pretty wide open space to expand, whereas the U.S. is always, like with Latin America, sort of takes it for granted, right, that they can do what they need to there. And American diplomats are always trying to get American business to invest in Africa, but they just won't do it. Now, in U.S. aid is not, is relatively small, right? We imagine the idea of giving money to people, I think sometimes seems outrageous to people, but the amount is pretty marginal, right? It's not making a huge difference and it's certainly not spurring like major industrial development in a lot of these places, and that particularly we'll say in Africa or other places. It's usually more directed at supporting humanitarian issues, education, that type of thing. What the U.S. government is usually trying to do through the State Department is set up agreements, try to get investment in these places because the U.S. approach is free market, whereas the Chinese are able to come in with a larger, just like concentrated spend, like we'll build you some roads, a stadium, right? And then we'll get some kind of agreement with you to do X, Y, or Z, right? The US doesn't operate like that. So it's a kind of asymmetric sort of approach to development between those two governments. And the US often is a kind of initially falling behind on those, but then um, these governments have a little bit of a hangover because then they realize they're on the hook with another government to deliver something or open up for a strategic base or something like that maybe they didn't want to do. So yeah, I tend to read it more in those kind of an asymmetry between the U.S. and we'll say China in terms of investing in these places.
I think I agree with Dr. Shively. Over the years, China has built up this capacity of manufacturing, and kind of there has been too much capacity of manufacturing, and China had this need to expand its market, the domestic market, even though it's large, but it's not large enough. So these many of these are state companies, and they wanted to expand their market, so they just took the vacuum in Africa and Middle East. Also, it's related to the barrier of entry. It's relatively easier to navigate in these countries compared to Western Europe and North America. Maybe fewer regulations or restrictions, so it's easier for the Chinese companies to enter. Yeah, there is also strategic concerns as well. Like in Africa, there are oil and other critical minerals which China might be interested in. So there are several motivations behind this expansion into Africa.
All right, we're getting towards the end here. We have a very direct question from our audience of largely of students. It begins with a hypothetical. Suppose the younger generation is becoming more politically involved and is going to vote in this election at a higher rate than previous elections, that there will be a youth vote that outpaces previous youth votes. Uh, how do you think that's going to impact a stable American foreign policy? Could that change? And how quickly maybe could it change the our sense of our priorities abroad? Well, we'll leave it there, but let you talk directly to students about the importance of their votes in foreign policy considerations.
My first reaction was if the youth vote ramps up this election, it would have a huge impact just on the vote, right? On who wins. Based on existing patterns, it would pretty much put it in the bag for Harris because the youth vote is pretty small, but they're highly skewed toward Democrats at this point. So I think that would tip the election pretty decisively. But in terms of foreign policy, what's interesting is, or frustrating, is it takes years, a generation for things to filter through. So I've watched the debates, from when I was young. Are only now are the people who are sort of in professional positions, like those advisors for Vice President Harris, they're suddenly having an impact, but their frame of reference is, from 20 years ago. Not that it's completely out of date, right? They're very knowledgeable about what's going on, but their kind of read of the world is based on that earlier era. So I think the youth engagement matters, but on foreign policy in particular, it can have a slow impact because it matters because they carry weight in the electorate or they are active and put pressure. I mean, the other thing is so voting matters, but also if you're active, right, and in advocating whatever your policy positions are, younger people have more sometimes time, flexibility, energy, or whatever. And you saw that last year with the October 7th attacks in Israel responding. Not that all young people are necessarily left-leaning, but what you saw was a lot of activism among the young on that issue, right? So I think those are the two avenues, a kind of slow effect over time, but then also immediate on voting and on activism, getting engaged, that type of thing.
I think I by and large agree. Real change is going to take time, and that I think that is the unfortunate thing. Not to be crass, but the older generations need to die away, and make room for new voices. That's just kind of the way it works, and it does take time. But from the students that we have, and from the students I've seen over the last decade or so, uh, it is clear that they have a fundamentally different view on some of these international topics. They are much more in tune to human rights, other more social issues than my generation and sort of the generation, before me as well. That being said, what I would be curious to see and will look for in the next, decade or so, as these younger students get older, do they hold the same sort of views towards those social issues, or do they do what political science research typically expects? It's as you get older, you shift away from that and you start to focus on other sort of more traditional aspects of politics that we kind of think of the older people sort of focusing on. And who knows, we might finally be at the point where we have generations that break that, and do maintain that sort of focus, even as they reach the age where they start to have a much more impactful say in politics. But certainly, the things I've seen so far is suggestive. But I think what Dr. Shively said is right. We don't want to treat the youth vote as a monolith. There is variation, there is competing visions. And while we do have a large strain of students focused on these more humanist issues, I also see a strain of students much more laser focused on national security, concerns about foreign enemies, and things of that nature, which could cause or at least create debates in the future, which as we would expect. So vote, get out there, vote, and know that someday, and that might be sooner than I expect or others expect, you'll have a much bigger say in sort of influencing foreign policy.
I think it's good for us to demonstrate a little bit of critical self-awareness, right? We around it, part of the environment right now is a resurgence of populism in the country, which is suspicious of experts and people bearing credentials. All of us have doctors in front of our names. And so I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about one thing that you used to be pretty sure of, like you would go take it to the bank. Like at least we can, this thing is true. This we can be confident that this is the case. And now you're not so sure of that thing anymore. Like that you've become disabused of. Sort of in the mode of what you were talking about there, Dr. Kreischer, where maybe when you're a younger voter or when you're a young graduate student, but you used to think one thing, but now that's been called into question and it can't be taken for granted.
U.S. political institutions will actually function as designed, and a realization that accepted norms play a much, much, much larger role in what we expect from the American government and sort of American democracy. And what we've seen, not just in the US, but in other countries, is those norms can erode incredibly quickly. And I think in part that's what we're seeing, not just in the US, but in Europe and elsewhere as well. So a sort of staunch belief in institutions just being able to be there and do what they're supposed to do. Not so much. Norms play a much larger role. So I think that's maybe where I got disillusioned along the way. And probably a good thing I've already taken my, seminars, or else, my American core seminar. Probably would have had much different discussions than what they did when I was in grad school.
Yeah, this might not be related to foreign policy, but I think my view about the Chinese regime has changed a lot compared to what I thought of it when I was a college student and now. So I used to think of Chinese regime as so first of all, it's authoritarian, it's not democratic, it's gonna collapse basically in a minute. And I believe in the power of popular movements. That's what we observed in Hong Kong, also somewhere, some places in China. But gradually, when I learn more, read more, and realize it's more complex than that. Also, yeah, as Dr. Crisher mentioned, like people have different more norms. Like people understand democracy in different ways. So democracy might be defined differently in different countries. So people in China, like the majority of the public, they still support the regime. They want stability. They think democracy is not just about multi-party elections. It could be about like the delivery of quality service, the maintenance of security and order. All these are important just to regular people. So that's in that aspect, my view kind of changed a lot. Also, in terms of China, well, yes, popular movement can still make a difference. It's a non-institutionalized channel for people to express their demands, but it's unlikely to change the Chinese regime because the majority of the party is still, majority of the population, they still support the regime, they benefit from the stability. Also, yeah, the more likely possibility for China to change regime is probably internal divisions between the elite, like what we observed in the 1980s. Otherwise, it's very unlikely to happen in the near future.
I don't want this to turn into the panel of disillusionment or despair, but obviously there are many things on a personal level that for me have changed. One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is how the ability to change their minds about things in the way that you do, or for people to be at the same place. Maybe that's the right way to frame it is um, I started at one place kind of understanding how, say, U.S. democracy works or voting or U.S. foreign policy. And as I've grown in that knowledge, I'm baffled that other people don't agree with my views or my conclusions because I've reached them through trying to study and understand things better. And the reality is everybody's at a different place, right, in terms of their personal experience, um, their what they value, their relationship to the world and their biography, right? So I guess it's a realization of empathy, maybe, that people are just at different places at different times. I'm still optimistic that you can move, like say, foreign policy in a positive direction, but it takes a lot more work than I thought, right? It isn't just like, oh, here are the reasons. You have to understand where people are coming from. You have to work through the political system, and repeat things a lot so that they sink in. So basically, the way people work and the way they interact with our political system, I thought was a little more straightforward. Um, and honestly, I have more sympathy for politicians because we love to hate them, but they're just responding to the incentives we give them, right? So if they're dissembling, they change their minds, they're being super careful with what they say, it's because of what we expect from them. So I don't always agree with them or like that, but I understand more than I used to why that's happening, right? Because it's this kind of interaction. So yeah, that's a good question, a tough one.
All right. Well, we don't want to end. We don't want to send them away with an overly gloomy calculus here. And so I had originally thought to ask you guys in closing, sort of like, what's one thing we should be worried about that we haven't even talked about, right? Let's not do that. Let's instead say maybe a source of strength or resilience that in your studies you found, that maybe we tend to in our anxiety that we underrate, an ability or a well, anyway, a source of stability that maybe isn't talked enough about?
I would say that despite the political environment that has arisen over the US in the last, decade or so, the US is still seen as a destination for people to go to. People still want to come here and people still want to be a part of the US. And I think that's something we do take for granted and don't appreciate that, despite the dysfunction, we do have people that still want to be here and contribute. And cutting the flow of those people off is probably not a good idea. We should, the people that want to be here and contribute, we should absolutely welcome them and keep them here and allow them to contribute. So the fact that we still have people that want to come here, I think is a good plus.
Maybe um somewhat related, I don't know, is just that I guess as I alluded to, I do feel optimistic that things can improve and get better on kind of macro scale. We're sort of individually, when we look at our immediate circumstance, we look at how things are working and we just don't see how they could keep working like that. It just seems like it's going to fall apart, right? But working, we can work toward a better world, I guess. I don't know how to frame that in a less gauzy way, but you can work toward relying less in foreign affairs on violence and coercion, right? You can try to advocate for greater access to wealth and development and that type of thing in ways that are mutually beneficial, right? That aren't just exclusive or you can do it in a way that pairs self-interest, I guess, state interest, because that's the reality we live in, with long-term improvement. And the other thing is we're not condemned to conflict, right? That with the way we've been talking about the US and China, for example, is like, oh, well, these two great powers are going to go at it. That's just the tradition. But in fact, we see a lot of learning. It's from terrible things, right, in the last century. But the reality is we haven't fallen into that problem, even at the height of the Cold War, because there was some level of learning. But that involves education, getting people to feel, right, to empathize with those prior experiences and helping us recognize that there are other ways, right, to exist together that don't involve falling into that type of massive conflict. So I I guess I'm an optimist at some level. It seems like we're not condemned the way sometimes we feel like we are.
In terms of the regional order in Asia, I feel optimistic as well. I think the US will continue to be a leader in the region with its allies, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, Thailand, all these countries. As I said, there has been a relatively high level of continuity in terms of foreign policy. So the status quo might be more likely compared to immediate conflict, even though conflict might not be inevitable. For example, like under Trump administration, even though Asian security wasn't the priority at the time, he was more concerned about the trade relations with China. But actually, Taiwan-U.S. alliance has been strengthened at the time. For example, arms sales increased at the time. High-level officials from the U.S. visited Taiwan. So, yeah, I think there is still some confidence over the U.S. role in Asia and in the world as well to maintain stability and fulfill its commitment.
All right, so there we go. We're not the dismal science like those economists, right? Here we have hope as well as the promise of enduring conflict too. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thanks to each of the panelists. It's good to hear you and see you and talk about these things together. Our next event will be next week. We have a viewing on campus of the French Oscar film. I'm going to say it in English, Delicious, right? A revolutionary era story about French cuisine. So we hope you all come out and see that and keep thinking about revolutions in European politics. All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.